I'll throw some, I guess, words out there, and I'll try to give a little context to them as we go. We look for. It's very important for us that our players are self-regulators, right? And what that means to us is a player who knows who they are and takes responsibility for their own development, right? So they'll actually drive the process themselves, right? While we create an environment and we're supportive in the environment, we try to facilitate the learning and the growth of a player. Ultimately, it's up to the player themselves. So we look for self-regulators and we try to get a little background on players um, from their coaching directors, their coaches, right? To find out if does this player, is he self-reflective? Does he try to work on his own to get better? Does he make plans? Does he set goals for himself? Right. So we look for players like that. We look for players that what I'll say is are very comfortable on the ball. All right. Our style of play is very possession oriented. We want to dictate play when we have the ball. Um, I think the modern game, you're beginning to see players are very flexible positionally, right? So, if you look at the modern game, you're seeing your fullbacks invert and play in the interior of the field rather than on the wide areas. So these players also be very comfortable on the ball, where I think years ago you may have found, you know, this player's a specialist, right? He's built for this particular role. And that's where he has to play, because if he comes over here, he's not very successful. Well, I think the game is changing now, so we're looking for players that are really comfortable on the ball, right? That can play with the ball. So we look at players that are intelligent, because the decision making at the highest level is the difference maker, right? So we look for players that are taking information maybe differently on the field, that are prepared before they receive the ball for their next actions, right? So there are little cues that as coaches and as evaluators of talent, we can begin to look for to determine if a player has this next level intelligence on the field. We're looking at players that are team first, right? And where I recognize these things, uh, often in transitional moments, you can really tell if a player is team first, right? When your team loses the ball, if the player transitions very quickly to win the ball back as part of a group of players that are transitioning quickly, then that begins to give you some clues that the player is a team first player, right? How well they defend set pieces, how hungry they are at defending set pieces. There are little, again, cues there that we can see if a player is more about himself or more about the team first. Um, we look for players that are risk takers, right? That aren't afraid to make a mistake. Um, we think that's really important to the growth of a player, that they're willing to make mistakes and they're willing to take these risks, and that we can work with them again, with being this self-regulator, that they begin to learn when, where, how to take these risks as the games become more and more driven by winning, which is later, right? We think this idea of risk takers is very important. And then last, we want a player that will work, right? A player that is a normal hard worker, right? Not a player that'll work hard when a coach shows up to watch, but a player that is a hard worker. That is part of that player's DNA. So we look for all those things in our players. And what's interesting, you could kind of take those pieces and you could kind of put them into brackets and say, well, okay, that's a technical piece, that's a tactical piece, that's a psychological piece, right? So we touched on things there. What's a little interesting about us is you really didn't hear me say much about the physical piece, and that's because when we look at players to come into our academy, that's probably the last piece we look at. Now, obviously, there are going to be some players that have unique physical characteristics, and those things will stand out. But ultimately, we believe the physical piece will come in time, and there's a baseline for that, and that stuff will come in time. But these other pieces for us are the most important.